Okay, we're in 89A, about 6 lines from the top. Tana Rabbanan. So we're continuing to discuss what workers are entitled to and while they work and the details. Tana Rabbanan, Daesh, threshing. Ma Daesh miyuchad b'davar shegidulei karka upol ochel bo. Just as, so why is the word Daesh used? So we take from that anything that's like Daesh in that threshing, in that just as this right for the worker to eat while he works is applies to Daesh, which is something that grows from the ground, and that you eat it when you're finished. In other words, when you're threshing, there's nothing else to do. Once you've threshed, that it's ready to eat. Of course, you do like karka um, so so it's actually unclear if that words in brackets should be included, but we're saying that anything that grows from the ground, that's what the worker can eat while he's working. Yatsa, hacholev, so that excludes somebody who's milking, machabetz, someone who's working with milk solids, or pressing cheese, megabein, she'en gudulei karka vein kol achol. This is not something that grows from the ground. It comes from a cow, so it doesn't apply. So when you're milking a cow or making cheese, you're not allowed to eat while you work. Lamali. So Gemara says, why do I even need anybody to tell me this? Mi kitavo b'kerem nafka. The whole context that the Torah gives you is already stated. Kitavo b'kerem when you go into a vineyard. A vineyard is something that's gudule karka. So from there you can take the idea that it has to be something that grows from the ground. No, we still need to be told about Daesh. Since if it already used the word kama, which is grain, standing grain, and that expands the idea. It's not just a vineyard; it's also grain. So I would have thought, l'rabos nami, I mean, they'd love you like maybe would also include milking or other things that are not growing from the ground. Kamash malan. So Daesh limits the expansion. First, we're talking about vineyards, and then the Torah expands it to grain. But Daesh limits that expansion, adkan till there, and don't apply it to things that don't grow in the ground.
But you could apply it to things that are standing, and cows stand. And when the ox that has to be killed because it scored someone, the ox has to stand before the court. So you could have gone in the other direction.
And so cows are also
Yeah.
Okay.
They didn't, obviously, but
yeah. Tanya, we have another thing to learn from Daesh. This is what was in brackets before, but now we're including it specifically, things that you eat when it's completed. Also something that you eat only when it's completed. That excludes somebody who's weeding. You've got garlics and onions growing, and your job is to weed it. So weeding is not gemar malacha. Like picking it is gemar malacha, right? So if your job is to weed, then you can't eat the garlic and onions that you're working with. And since that's not the end of the work, that's not the finishing touch that makes it edible, so you can't eat those as you work. Lamali, where it says, so I could figure that out too. In giving the worker the right to eat while he works, the Torah specifies that you can't put it in your pocket, right? So if it's not ready for eating, obviously you wouldn't put it in your pocket. So maybe take it from there. My answer is even though like when you're weeding, you might be pulling out some onions also, right? Like onions that are not growing well or something like that. So you would have thought that that's something you could put in your pocket, but it's still not gemar malacha. You haven't been hired to do the harvesting of the onions themselves. Therefore, you can't eat them while you work. Tanidach, another thing from Daesh. Just as Daesh threshing is something that like once you finish threshing, it's not yet subject to maser. Right, maser is once you've gathered it into the threshing floor, I think, right, or you've gathered it into the house. But we're not at a maser stage yet. So, um, but you can still eat from it. Of course, shalom nigmar malachta maser. So anything else, even though it's not maser ready yet, you can still eat from it. Yata, what does that include? Habodel, bitmarim, uvigrogros. Someone who's separating dates or figs. Hoven nigmar malachta maser. Since now it's masa already, like once you do your job, it's masa already. And polochabo, that's not something you can eat. You can eat, when you're working in the field, to pick something before, and not yet make it masa ready. That's when you can eat. But if you're making something masa ready, then that's not a place where you can eat. Vatanya, but the Gemara says, I'll challenge that. The specific rice says the opposite. That in this case, if you're separating figs or dates, you can eat from it. We're talking about dates that aren't going to ripen, right? These are dates that are like whatever, kind of an arrested development thing, I guess. So they have to be stored put in storage until they ripen. So in that case, they're not master ready yet because they're not ripe. So when the Brisa says a fig sorter can eat from the figs, that's when they're not master ready. In other words, they're not ripe yet. They need to be put in storage until they can ripen. So it's not master ready. So those you can eat. Tanya Daesh, another derivation from Daesh. Just as Daesh is something where, just like we said about Maser, it's not ready for challah, right? Because when is something ready for challah? When you mix the dough. So you can eat from the threshing, your threshing work, because it's not challah ready. So too, it's only other things that are not chal already you can eat from. Yatza, what does that exclude? Halash, famakate va'ofa, the kneader and the braider and the baker, right? Once they're done with their work, the thing is chal already, and so it's not eligible for snacking on. Those are ready for challah. And so you can't eat from it while you work. But the Gemara says, well, wait a second. So this is something that is already masa ready once it's in the bakery and being worked with, right? So we said that that nigmar malachto lemaser, it's you can't eat it, right? So how come one second. Right. So like we're only excluding starting from the kneading process, but what about like the measuring process, right? Before you knead it. So if that's your job, that's already masa ready, so you shouldn't be able to eat it. But this implies that if it's not up to the kneading process yet, then you would be able to eat it. So that seems to be contradictory. Our answer is Lokasha, but Chutzlaritz Laskina, the Leikamasa. We're talking about Chutzlaritz, and Chutzlaritz, there's no maser, it's not relevant, so there's no cutoff there. Chala nami, like Bar says, well, chala also is biblically only applies to Eretz Yisrael, right? So don't tell me, you can't make that distinction. Eliyalam, Ba'aretz, V'lo. So we're actually talking about in the land of Israel. And here's how we resolve the contradiction. B'sheva shekibshu, b'sheva shechilku. There were the 14 years that Yoshua conquered and divided the land of Israel. And during that time, the Amar, we had a brisa, Sheva Shekibshu, Sheva Shechilko, those 14 years, that was a time when you did have Chala, the mitzvah of Chala, you didn't yet have the mitzvah of Maser, and that's how we can resolve. It's a bit, it's a little, unusual to say the least that the Brisa, without telling you, would be talking specifically only about those 14 years and way in the past. But that's how we can resolve the contradiction, that we're talking about a time when there was challah and there was no maaser. So there was, so you haven't passed, don't have the criteria that you've already past the point of eligible for Maser. It's not eligible for Maser because Maser didn't yet apply, and so the only criteria left to apply is eligibility for Chala. So where it says Nide Maser,
It's rare that Chazal talk about
refer to
mitzvah
that.
that
Yeah.
will never apply ever again. But there's
Uh-huh.
a sugya at the end of Masechtas Zvachim where they go into deals about Hilchot Bamot, which
Right.
have applied for
A
what,
long time.
3,000 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very, and you can see why it's unusual, right? Because
Yeah,
it's a little not so relevant to us. And if you're just, unless you say specifically that you're talking about that, it's very unusual to say that, oh, that must be what the Bryce is referring to.
right.
So, it's a bit of a difficult dodge.
So why would it talk about Chutz La'aretz only here? It could have applied Chutz La'aretz to any of the other issues where Maisa would be required. It mentioned him just by Chala, but it could be mentioned. It seems a little odd that he wants to resolve this price at this point with the idea of Chutz La'aretz. It could have mentioned this with any of the other foods that require Maisa.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure what you're expected it to say. Like, if the point of one of the Bryces that we did was that it's only that you're only subject to that the worker can snack on the stuff he's working with only up till the point of Maser. Okay, but so you would say in Chutz La'aretz it's understood that that doesn't apply, right? That, I mean, that you can keep that you can keep snacking. In other words,
Correct. So why just mention it now? We could have mentioned it.
No, now we're trying to wriggle out of a contradiction, because now we're trying to wriggle out of a contradiction, right? The contradiction between, well, what is the criteria of Chala or Maser? So we're trying to find a place where one applies and the other doesn't. And then mentioning Chutz La'aretz actually was completely ineffective because they're both subject. They're both only biblically apply in Eretz Yisrael. So it was that was a very brief and weak point to make at all. So I don't know if that answers your question really, but so now the Gemara says, Midei Maser Kagarim, Gemara Malacha Kagarim. First, the Gemara says, what does Maser have to do with anything? it's completing the work that really ends this benefit of the worker. Like, what does Maser have to do with it at all? So the Gemara is rejecting the whole Maser theory anyway. Elam Ravina Karoch Utane. What you want to do is combine these two brises as follows. Daish. Ma daish miuchad davar shlo nigmar malachta lemaser ulachala poel ochelbo. Combine those two things. Just as daish is something that hasn't been completed regarding maser and chala, and that's when the worker can eat it. Avkol shlo nigmar malachta lemaser ulachala poel ochelbo. So he's kind of mushing them together and saying that just like daish, anything else that the worker eats from has to be like Daesh in the sense that can't be ready for Maser and Chala. Now, whether it's Maser and Chala or Maser or Chala is a little unclear. So leave it to you to figure that out. Another question. Poel Moshe Yahavhev Be'ur V'yochal. So you're working with grain. Can you toast the grain on fire and eat it? In other words, you're in the field, you want to snack on the grain, but you like it better toasted, so you light a fire and toast it. Is that kind of considered incidental eating? Although, is it like grapes and the other things? We saw the other day, 2 days ago, that you can't eat anything together with the grapes, right? So is this like grapes and an appetizer, or grapes and something else? Or is it like, is the fire considered a something else? Tashma, let's see if we can prove it. Rashai Balmais Lahashkos Polim Yain Kadesh Leochlu Anavim Harbe. The employer can give the workers wine, because if they drink a lot of wine, they won't be so hungry for the grapes. So he's more concerned about the grape harvest than his old wine. So that's allowed. And Rashayin Polim and Tabel Pita Mitzir Kadesh Leochlu Anavim Harbe. And if the employees want to eat salty food that will stimulate their appetite so that they'll be hungry for more grapes, they're allowed to do that too. So it looks so you would say that maybe toasting the grapes would be like eating making them more appetizing, right? Which seems like it should be allowed. Our answer is Lachshuri Gavrilo. Now that's different. That's if you are manipulating the person, right? You're making the person hungrier. But that's not, you can't prove from that you can manipulate or toast the actual food. You can't bring a proof of that. Key come violent Lachshuri Pero. What we're asking about is, can you manipulate or process the food and still be allowed to eat it? So what about that? Tashma, we'll try another proof. You can eat the grapes at the head of the row that you're working on. In other words, you can kind of, you want to take a snack when you finish working this row, so you can pick grapes along the way and eat it when you get to the end of the row. That's kind of a goal that you set for yourself when you were going to have a snack. But you can't, don't go so far as to say you can toast the grapes or whatever, if it's grain. You can't cook them. You can't toast them in fire. So that's a specific answer of our question, right? That's what we're trying to find out. Are you allowed to toast the grain? Our answer is also mishum bitul malacha. That's talking about because when you get to the end of the row, you're going to take a break to eat all the grapes you carried. So then you're not keeping to your assigned hours. You're stealing time, right? Kikam violin. What we're asking about hecha deika ishto vanov. So wouldn't you say the same thing about, well, you have to light the fire and toast it? No, maybe your wife is there and she starts the fire, and as you pass by with your work, you can, maybe she's carrying the fire around in a portable barbecue or something. So you toss them while you're working, you toss them on the flame, and you eat them. So that's what we're asking about. So what about that? Tashma, try another proof. Lo Another brisa says you cannot toast the produce and eat it. So it's specific answers our question. And you also can't heat it in the earth, like bury it on a hot sunny day to eat it, to warm it up. You can't crush it on a rock and eat it. But you can crush it in your hand. So it's trying to be specifically we're talking about, while you're working, right? So crushing it in your hand is fine, but this other processing, including toasting it on the fire, is not allowed according to this process. So it's very clear. Why says Hasam you should be Malacha? No, that's because you have to stop your work, but you could still ask, what if somebody else is doing it for you? You have your wife and kids who are following you around with the with the um with the fire. So Hachinam Mistabra, and that also makes sense. Because if you're thinking about, if you think that the reason the Brisa says that you can't do all these things, these extra things to improve the produce before you eat it, sella my metuke perika, like crushing it on a rock, that doesn't add any taste to it just by crushing it on a rock. So my answer is EF should tech portat. No, because why are you even crushing it on a rock? It's got to be a little bit better, as in small pieces rather than as a whole thing. So we're not going to accept that. But still, we're saying that the whole reason that you're not allowed to do all these things is mishum bitul malacha, right? That you're taking time away from your employer. But if somebody else is doing the toasting for you, it might still be okay. Tashma, so need another proof. Calling shoyu odrim b'tainim v'godrim b'tamarim ubosrim b'anavim umoskin b'zeisim. Workers who are picking figs or dates or grapes or olives. Harei elu ochlim u'pturim. They can eat, and there's no master on them. Shatorah ziksalahem, because the Torah is entitling them to that produce. Bepitam lo yochlu, but you can't put it in a sandwich. Elim Kane, not Lurishus Mivalabais. You have to ask permission to eat it in a sandwich. Presumably because of the because you can't eat grapes with something else, right? As we saw the other day. You can't dip it in salt. So if you can't dip it in salt, that's like processing in a way, right? So maybe we can derive from that you also can't toast it. Where it says melach vadai ka'anavim v'davar achanami. Adding salt is really adding something, but toasting it doesn't add an ingredient. Maybe that's not the same as adding an ingredient. Maybe that would still be permitted. So we're out of proofs and we have not resolved the question. So we're just going to go on. New topic. You can't dip it in salt and eat it, or aminu. But we have a question on that. You hire a worker to do work the ground under olive trees. You can't eat the olives because you're not working with the olives. But if you hire him to pick grapes or pick olives or pick other types of fruit, that person can eat, and there's no maser. Because the Torah gives it to you. If he if part of the deal was that you're allowed to eat, achas v'achas yochal. So then you can eat them one at a time, but you can't eat two at a time. The sofes b'melach v'yochal, and you can dip the fruit in salt and eat it. So now dipping the fruit in salt. What does that apply to? Ilay Masefer. We're talking about the end, the 2x2. Came or the where this was a condition of employment. Came on the kotzas kol heichel lechel. Since you included in the contract that you can eat as you work. So you can eat however you want, right? We're not relying on the Torah law here. We're saying like a part of my contract is I can eat while I work. I like to eat with salt, so I'm going to eat with salt. That's okay. So then that's so it's obvious, right? Elalav aresha. So we must be talking about the beginning of the brisa where you're eating because the Torah gave you the right to eat. So this brisa then is against the previous brisa. The previous brisa says you can't dip in salt when you're eating, by Torah law, and this one apparently implies that you cannot. Or by lokasha. Bai says resolves the contradiction as follows: Kan ba'aretz, kan b'chutz la'aretz. Now, the first brisa is talking about where you can't dip in salt. That's in Eretz Yisrael, and the second brisa, which allows dipping in salt, is outside of Israel. Why? Ba'aretz kava sefisa. In Eretz Yisrael, what happens when you dip it in salt and it's like ready to eat? That's like gathering it in. Then you're required in master. But chutz la'aretz lo kavius fisa. There's no master in chutz la'aretz. So that's why there's a distinction, right? Because of the master issue. Amar Rava Meika mide debaretz kavas fisa midarai says there's such a thing that that in Eretz Yisrael dipping in salt makes him chayiv and master. B'chutz la'aretz lo kavas fisa mutar lichatchila. And outside of Eretz Yisrael, dipping in salt is permitted. Like he's saying, like it's the same act, so when the rabbis established how you do this, they typically do it in a way that mirrors or models the Doraisa one, right? If they're establishing something that models the Doraisa thing, they'll do it in the same way. So it's true in Eretz Yisrael, and outside of Eretz Yisrael, there is no actual maser. But when the when the rabbis set the rules of when you can eat and when you can't eat, they would typically set the same rules, even if the same reasons don't necessarily apply. Elam Rava, so Rava wants to make a different distinction. Bein baris, bein b'chutz la'aretz, chadol l'kavas fisa. In whether in Israel or outside of Israel, eating one at a time, then that doesn't make, like if you dip one grape in salt, that doesn't make it subject to maser. Tarte kavas fisa, but if you dip two at a time, then it's like a group, then it's more like a process, then that does establish maser. Therefore, katzatz, if you say in the contract, I'm contracting that I can eat while I work, then bein safas, bein lo safas, then I can dip in salt if I want to. Then he can eat one at a time, but not two at a time. Low katzatz, but if it were going by Torah law of the low safas and you're not dipping, ochel shtaim shtaim, then you can eat two at a time. Safas, but if you're dipping, achas achas, ochel shtaim shtaim lo yochel. If you're dipping, then you can only do it if you dip one. Even if you ask for permission, the eat bal lehu lamaser v'kavas fisa, because if you've got two together, then it becomes subject to maser. And it's now you need maser, you can't be eating it. Okay, so the Gemara says, wait a minute, the tarte, the kavos visaminal. Where do you get this idea that if there's two together, then that makes it subject to maser? If you're dipping two in salt, Amar of Masa, the Amar Kra, he keeps them ke Omer Garna. One second. So a pasuk in Micha says, "You've gathered them like sheaves to the threshing floor." So how does this prove anything? So it is based on gathering, right? So the idea that two together is something that's gathered, and the pasuk in Micha demonstrates that gathering something is like an omer at the Goren. So, and that's when something becomes subject to maser. So it's a bit of an indirect way to demonstrate that gathering things in groups, like two or more, is something that makes them subject to maser, and then you wouldn't be allowed to eat them as you go if you're dipping two at a time. Okay. And we will pick up here tomorrow.
Yasher Koach. Have a great day.
Have a good day.
Have a great
everybody.
day. Thank you.